weekend, and that the technical corrections greatly improve the bill from the point of view of employers. This is what the Treasury Department says. Under the legislation, employers receive a dollar-for-dollar refundable tax credit for the COVID-19 related sick and family leave payments made to their employees. As amended, they mean the technical corrections over the weekend, the credit is carefully calibrated, in the Treasury's words, to ensure there is no sick or family leave requirement in excess of the credit. The legislation now also includes explicit grants of regulatory authority to both the Secretary of Labor and the Secretary of Treasury to ensure consistency between the leave requirements and the credit provisions. In addition, and this is what the Treasury officials have been saying to us over the last few days, the legislation now provides that the sick and family leave payments are not considered wages for employment tax purposes. The legislation now extends the employer credit to include costs for maintenance of health benefits paid by the employer while employees are on leave. Lastly, the Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service are considering options to provide an advance payment for the refundable credit to ease any tax flow burden that a small fraction of employers may experience. I'll have more to say about that in a minute, but what that means in plain English, they're considering a way to make sure that before the employer has to pay this required family leave to an employee, that the federal government has given the money to the employer. Besides this, the legislation now includes an explicit grant of authority, Treasury says, to the Secretary of Labor to exempt small businesses from the only long-term leave requirements it contains where those requirements would result in financial hardship. And then the Treasury, in their conversations with me and in the writings that they've sent out, make the argument that far from imposing special burdens, the net effect of this legislation is to provide an important benefit, given that many already provide sick leave and that many more will need to do so in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Moreover, by structuring coverage for paid sick leave as a credit, the legislation ensures that employers generally receive relief immediately rather than having to wait for a refund. In the event the amount of the credit exceeds an employer's tax liability, the credit is made refundable to ensure that the employer is fully compensated for all payments made under the leave requirements. And the Treasury goes on to say, Treasury and IRS are working on options to provide an advance payment of the credit to get cash in the pockets of small businesses and their employees immediately. The intent of the legislation, the Treasury argues, is to fully fund the payments employers make to their employees who experience employment interruptions related to COVID-19. In summary, the amended legislation does not require employers, according to the Department of Treasury, to make payments in excess of amounts eligible for the refundable tax credit, nor does it require employers to pay employment taxes on those amounts. To the contrary, it provides an important and immediate benefit to small business and their employees for whom financial assistance is needed as quickly as possible. That is the argument of the Secretary of the Treasury and his subordinates in conversations with many of us over the last few days. That is their intention. Now, I read that in detail because in the Dakotas and in Tennessee and in many places all across this country, there are about, if my figures are right, about 6 million businesses that could be affected by this mandate that employ 51 million employees, or at least they did employ 51 million employees until all of the problems created by this virus. Now, having tried to be fair and given you what I understand the Treasury's intention to be, which I think will be useful to the owners of small business, to their accountants, and to their lawyers who are trying to figure out the law that was passed today. Here are my problems with it. Number one, I'm not sure the Treasury can live up to its promise to make sure that the employer has the money from the federal government before the employer has to pay the sick leave to the employee. Now, here's my principle. I think sick leave and family leave in these circumstances is a good idea. I mean, if someone's quarantined for 2 weeks, I think all of us should have to pay the cost of that. And for another 10 weeks, some of the cost of the medical and family leave. I buy that. I can support that. But I believe if Washington, D.C. is going to require it, Washington, D.C. should pay for it. If Washington, D.C. is going to require a small business, many of which are struggling, many of which are going out of business, to pay a new mandate, Washington should pay for it. This is no time to be imposing on small businesses an expensive new mandate or unexpected new cost when they can't, when they have money, they don't have money coming in to pay for the normal costs that they have. Now, I know that it is the goal of the Secretary to let it work this way, because he's told me this, he's told all of us this, he said it in public, he put out a statement. Under the sick leave proposal, every couple of weeks, a businessman will put aside enough money for withholding and Social Security taxes. That adds up to about 15% of salary of an employee. What the Treasury is saying is that the employer can use that money, instead of setting it aside for the government, you can use it to pay sick leave. Well, there are two problems with that. One is, I don't like the idea of the employer using the employee's tax money. You usually get in trouble for that. If I set aside the senator from the Dakotas tax payment and then I use it for some purpose, you can go to jail for that in some cases. At least it's inappropriate. So I'm uncomfortable with that, which means that the business might only have 7.5% of the salary set aside for that purpose. But even if it's 15%, I'm not sure it's enough. Well, the Treasury Secretary said, we understand that, so we'll allow advance payment, and we hope that we can come up with a system that would get it there immediately. He hasn't promised that it would come in one day, but his objective, I'm sure, if he were here on the Senate floor, would say, I'd like to get it there the same day. Well, wanting to get it there the same day and getting it there are two different things. And if I'm a small business person in Tennessee and I know that I'm going to have to cut a payroll check on Monday and that I have no money coming in to pay for it, and there's not enough money in my escrow account to pay for it, I want my money from the federal government before I cut the check. And so, Mr. President, I intend to try to amend the legislation that we passed this weekend to say that with sick leave and paid family leave, since Washington is requiring it and Washington is paying for it, then Washington will need to make sure the employer has the money before the employer has to pay the check. That's number one. Number two, I want to make sure that the employer doesn't have to pay more on sick leave than the federal government cap. There's a cap, I think it's about $132,000 annualized pay on sick leave, and if an employee makes more than that, that employee is going to have to take a pay cut, or he might use or she might use the private right of action to sue the employer to say, I want you to pay the gap between $132,000 and whatever I made. Well, you may say, I'm not too sympathetic to the employee who makes that much money. I'm not talking about being sympathetic to the employee. I'm talking about being sympathetic to the employer who may not have any money. Remember, this is a Washington mandate, and Washington should pay for it. Now, the Treasury Department has amended through technical changes this past weekend. They said so in the information I just read. They've amended the bill to try to make that clear, and I hope that is successful. Third, layoffs. I mentioned the restaurant industry. There are 15 million people who work in the restaurant industry. If they're not laid off now, they're going to be mostly all laid off before very long. And unfortunately, Mr. President, none of those men and women who've been laid off are eligible for this sick leave, because you're going to have to work for 30 days for this small business, this company with less than 500 employees, in order to be eligible for the paid sick leave. So I'm afraid as a result of this, many employers worried about this provision may have an incentive to lay off more of their employees. But the truth is, they don't need much more incentive, because you're a restaurant and you've been told by the local health board to close down. You don't have any money coming in. You can't pay your employees anyway, and so you don't have any choice. But my point is that this is a very limited benefit in the restaurant industry and probably in many other industries, because it does not help the laid off employee. And finally, there's been a lot said that, well, for the smallest companies, those with less than 50, that you can apply to the Secretary of Labor and he'll make you exempt from the mandate. Well, I think that's a good idea, because that's the small mom and pop diner, that might be the kennel that I just talked about that might have 3 or 4 employees. They're not accustomed to dealing with all of this Washington legalese and requirements and regulations. They're not geared up for that. But as I read the language in the law, it's a much narrower exception than that. And so I'm going to attempt to amend the law that passed today to broaden the exception so the Secretary of Labor has more authority to waive the mandate for businesses with less than 50. So as I said, Mr. President, there are a number of important benefits in the bill we passed today, especially on testing. We've seen a great increase in the number of available tests over the last few weeks. The governor of Tennessee said yesterday that we have sufficient testing. Well, that's for today, maybe not for tomorrow or the next day. One of the greatest steps forward has been to finally allow commercial testing to be used. I mean, why shouldn't the Mayo Clinic be able to go ahead, or Cleveland Clinic be able to go ahead and develop a test and move ahead with it? So now that they can. But while we've done a great deal, there's a great deal more that we must do. I'm convinced that even if we do, as Senator McConnell has said, and pass our Phase 3 legislation this weekend, which would include loans to small businesses, direct payments to individuals, stabilizing payments to automobiles, to airlines, for example, and maybe other industries, that there's more to do. And my guess is that the next step after that, Phase 4, let's call it, is to look to our state employment compensation systems and make sure that they're able to handle the large number of people who are losing their job because the government is shutting down the economy in order to contain the disease. I voted for the Johnson Amendment today to the bill that I later voted for because I thought it was headed in the right direction. Rather than Washington issuing mandates, I would rather Washington work with the states in an existing program, make sure states have sufficient funding on top of their own funds to deal with a large number of auto workers, restaurant workers, and workers at the small kennel with 2 or 3 employees. Make sure that they have sufficient funds, and I believe in addition to that, the figure in the weekly fund is going to have to be higher than the $327 that it is in Tennessee. This is unprecedented. We're closing down the economy in order to contain the disease, and because we're doing that, we governments at all levels, we're going to have to pay the bill. I thank the President. I yield the floor.